How we doing? Hey, friends. Thank you for that smattering of applause. Appreciate that. No, I don't want your pity applause. Appreciate that, though. That was a pity applause. I appreciate that. No, let me do actually something reasonable first. Again, my name is Scott Hanselman. That's my email. That's also my PayPal and my Cash App. So just FYI, if you feel really good, you can tip me. I work for Microsoft right now, but I worked before Microsoft. I worked at Nike and I worked at Intel. And even though Microsoft is known for Windows, I am non-denominational. When I was at Nike, I did Java on big Linux machines, talking to big IBM mainframes, and I've been certainly in computers since before Windows, and I'm sure I'll be in computers after Windows. But I do enjoy Windows, and I know a lot of people have a lot of strong feelings about it. But I'm going to show you some stuff that maybe you haven't seen before. I'm going to try to go pretty technical and tell a couple of stories about how things are set up, and hopefully show you some things that you may not already know. And if you don't like it, I don't care, because that means more Windows for me. Seriously, though, everything I'm showing you is free. I'm not selling you anything at all. And one of the other things that's important to note is that everything I'm showing you works on Windows Home. It is important if you have any students that might want to do this kind of stuff. You don't need to get Pro or buy a fancy SKU. So everything I'm showing you is totally free. Okay, cool. So there was a gentleman in the back who said that he hadn't used Windows in 6 years. I'm going to start there. And I do understand that this screen is not optimal and is not putting out a full 1080p, so I'm going to do a lot of zooming. So to the gentleman who used Windows a long time ago, this is the console host. When you type CMD, you get fake DOS. It's not really DOS, it just kind of looks like DOS. And you type things like dir, and you get things like this. And one of the things that Windows is known for is a phenomenally bad terminal. It's just awful, just garbage. And you can tell because you click Properties, and you get in here. And suddenly you're in the late 90s. And I think we've all spent some time in this dialog box trying to get it to do what you want it to do until you eventually just give up and then you buy a Mac. This is an interesting world and an interesting space because on Windows you have so many choices it can be overwhelming, and people will end up conflating the names of stuff, and that can be a little bit challenging. So I want to try to explain some of the names of things so we can understand what Windows offers for the Linux developer. I'm going to jump into dark mode notepad here, and I want to point out that I typed command.exe, which is fake DOS. By fake DOS, I mean it is not literally the DOS operating system. It's just this command line processor. And then I was given a prompt that looked like that, and that's a prompt. Then this is a shell. But people will also do things like type PowerShell, and they'll get something that looks like this, which is a totally different prompt, but shares this dialog box. And that gets a little bit confusing. So what ends up happening is that people conflate prompts, shells, command processors, scripting languages, terminals, and then they just casually use different words. So they say, oh yeah, what shell do you use? What's your prompt? Which terminal is that? And it's a totally normal thing to do. But for the purposes of education here, we're going to be pedantic. It doesn't matter, because that's what pedantic means. But it's worth pointing out, because if you want to really understand the full stack, it does matter a little bit. Now, what's interesting here is that I ran PowerShell, and here's that dialog box again. And then if I go and run fake DOS, and I click in the upper left-hand corner, there's that same dialog box. So that's interesting. The command prompt and PowerShell are both offering this same dialog box. Well, the thing that owns that dialog box is the thing that's drawing the pixels on the screen. And that is the con host, or the console host. And this is never anything that you would ever run on Windows. It's literally just the thing that drew the box. That's the terminal that sucks. So when you say to yourself, man, I find Windows very unsatisfying in the way that it handles its console output, you're frustrated with a 30-year-old console host. Now, when I go into fake DOS and I type something like dir, I'm going to keep zooming in here. Maybe I'll do something like this, dir/s. And now I'm doing a directory of the entire disk drive right here. One of the things that the old heads will know about Windows is the way that you make this go faster is you make it really, really small. Right? It's funny because it's true. It's funny because it's incredibly painful. What's the way to make it go as fast as possible? Minimize it. Why? Because unfortunately, the string processing that's happening, which is that prompt is creating strings and it's outputting it to the console host, and the console host is then rendering the font and painting it to the screen, is happening synchronously. So it can only get that directory out as fast as it can paint it to the screen. That, of course, is stupid. But it's historical stuff. It's just unfortunate. It's one of those things that happened. Okay? So in doing that, Microsoft has kind of realized that console host needs to go. So what they did is they replaced console host with the Windows terminal. The Windows terminal is now the default terminal on Windows. And it looks like this. Again, I'm going to do a little zoomy action here. And this is a replacement console host. You can go into settings here, and you can go to where it says default terminal application, and you can pull that down, and you have a choice between the legacy console host and the Windows terminal. You can do this on your machine now. You can go to the Windows Store, you type terminal, you get the new terminal, and you go into the settings, and then you can set it as the default. So if I do that and hit save, and then I go, Windows R and type CMD, and I run it, I'm going to be getting the Windows terminal, and I can tell because I got tab. But that isn't just that square around the outside. It's the entire console host subsystem, which is now basically open source, completely open source, available on GitHub. You can build it yourself, and it's kind of written like a game. C++, DirectX, 120 frames a second, super fast, yada, yada, yada. So then this is running at full speed. I can do kind of stuff like this, and I can resize stuff, and then I can even go and make it transparent. And it's wicked fast, as God intended. Okay? And I can click up here in the corner on this little chevron here, and then I've got a list of all of the different shells. Lots of different shells on Windows. On a Mac, for many, many years, you just kind of had this POSIX subsystem, this Linux-y, Linux close enough to be Linux, kind of a vibe, which is Darwin, which would then give you Bash. And then one day they made it ZSH, which is cool. But the kind of average Joe or Jane developer gets a Mac, they open a Xterm or iTerm2, they go to a command prompt, they think they're looking at Linux, they have ZSH, and they kind of accept those defaults. So historically on Windows, you open CMD, you get fake DOS and a lousy terminal, you're sad. On a Mac, you open iTerm or term, you get ZSH and something that's close enough to being Linux, and you go, awesome, and then things just work. Then the problem is that the Windows person decides to go out there into the world, and they want to do open source, and they go and they Google with Bing or something, and they find instructions on how to do something, and they go, hey, how to use Node, and it says open a terminal. They don't know what that is, and then they see that. Ironic that that's the symbol of open source for many people. And they look at that $sign and they go, well, my prompt doesn't look like that. And then they go, wah, wah. They don't feel like they're included because their prompt looks like something else. And then we get into the thing where Windows is like a second-class citizen, and then Ruby has a separate installer for it, and it's like a whole thing. Now, it's clear that Linux on the server has won. There was a time when Windows Server and IIS were a big thing. There was a time when Apache was a big thing. There was a time when Nginx was a bigger deal. But now everything is Cybernoodles and Kubernetes. That's fine. But Linux is the thing on the server. But a lot of people still develop on Windows and enjoy Windows very much. So how do we find that balance? Well, what we're doing is we are going completely overboard with the ability to choose. So what we're doing is offering not just the old command prompt, but also cross-platform PowerShell, which is a shell that runs on both Linux and on Windows that is open source, but also the ability to run Linux itself on Windows. So you can see here that I have Ubuntu, I have Alpine, I have Debian already installed, excuse me. But I want to call out Cygwin as a point of note. Oftentimes, people who have Windows, but maybe they tolerate Windows, their work gives them a Windows laptop, and then they go and they install Cygwin. So any Cygwin people here know what Cygwin is? Okay. So what Cygwin is, it is the GNU utilities recompiled against the Windows 32 APIs. So when you type ls on a system, it doesn't work, right? Because you don't have that. And if you go over to PowerShell and you type ls, you're really getting an alias for something else. And I'll talk about how to get pretty colors in a little bit. But then when you go into Cygwin and you type ls, actually, this is an interesting thing. The reason that that didn't work, because I haven't set up my Cygwin drive yet in my path. Cygwin implements ls like it is on Linux, which is with an executable. So there's ls.exe. They take all the GNU utilities like sed and awk and grep, and they're just .exe, and then they put them in a folder. You add that to your path, and then you get 60% of what you would need to run bash scripts and feel comfortable. That's why Cygwin exists. But Cygwin is not Linux. Cygwin is kind of in the matrix, but it is user mode Linux utilities, GNU utilities specifically recompiled for Windows, which is cool, but it's not Linux. So then how do we get Linux? Well, there is a utility on Windows. You have this now. You probably either don't use it or you haven't gotten around to using it. And it's called WSL.exe. And you can say WSL-list -online, and it will list out the Linuxes that are available to you. You can install Linux on Windows in one of two ways. You can go to the Windows Store and type Linux. Isn't that weird? Literally go to the Windows Store on the laptop you already own, on your kid's laptop, whatever. You type in Linux, you download Linux from the Windows Store. But because we're command line people, what we're going to do is type in WSL-install. And it will set your machine up to run Linux. And if I say list online, and I say I want to install Kali Linux, right? I could go and say --install -d Kali Linux, and now it's going to go and get that. So it's going to go and install Kali Linux. Now with the power of the internet here, this will be done tomorrow, and we'll have to deal with that. We'll see how that works out. Kali Linux would then appear in this menu. So I've got these here. Now, I am currently in PowerShell, and I put a little logo in the corner here. The Windows terminal is completely configurable with colors and fonts and glyphs and nerd fonts and all the kind of stuff. We've gone completely overboard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down this menu, and I'm going to hold down Alt with one finger here, and I'm going to click on Ubuntu. So now, while I have PowerShell on the left, and again, I'm making the fonts really big because of the screen size here, and I've got Ubuntu on the right, because there's the Ubuntu, right? And just a little bit of point of note, because I find it annoying, it is Ubuntu, not Ubuntu. It's a Zulu word, Xhosa word. My wife is a Zulu, and so Ubuntu. If anyone ever says Ubuntu at work, you just slap them across the face just really hard. Like, Ubuntu. Okay. So now I've got Ubuntu running over here. Now things get a little bit interesting here because you noticed how fast that came up. So then people will go and say the word just. I don't like the word just. I am guilty of doing that. Just is a minimizing word. The older you get and the longer you've been in software, when someone explains about a project that they worked on for 9 months with a team of 20, and then you go, oh, you're just running it in a VM. That is a way of just saying, well, that thing that you did, I could have done it in a weekend. Why did you need a team of 100 and it's 8 weeks, right? So I would encourage you to think about that, not just in interactions with me when I'm on stage at All Things Open, but also with your colleagues. Just is a really good way to make them feel bad about themselves. Because, are you just running it in a VM? It depends, right? Yes, there's a hypervisor involved, but let's talk about virtual machines and what we think about. Right now, I've got this laptop with a square screen, and if I were to go and run something like Hyper-V or VirtualBox or Parallels, I have this square, and then I have a square within the square, right? We've all done that. And Apple's really great about this with Parallels because then they make the square have its own separate desktop, and then people do the 4-finger swipe. You go, hey, look, I'm in a virtual machine, and hey, look, I'm in Mac, and then you go back and forth, and that's super cool. Everyone loves that whole vibe. Like I could go and make a new desktop here, wee, wee, wee. Like I've seen people buy Macs so that they could do the 4-finger swipe. It's very, very exciting, very exciting. By the way, while we were talking, Kali Linux set itself up, so I'm going to go and enter in my username and my password. I'm going to hope I typed it right twice. Then I'm going to go and close it, and then I'm going to go and close these, and then I'm going to go and run the terminal. Beep, boop, 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 boop. I always do sound effects because I want to make sure that everyone understands what's going on. Close that. Close that. Launch it. Kali Linux. Right there. Now I can go. Now I've got Ubuntu on the upper right, Kali Linux in the lower right, and Debian over on the left. And I can go and say LSB release-A, show you that that is a perfectly cromulent 2-year-old version of Ubuntu. Okay? Now you notice that I'm whipping around in here, and I'm very, very happy with this. I can also hit, if you really don't like Windows, you can just hit Alt-Enter, and then you just pretend like you're in like, screen or whatever. So yeah, that looks pretty cool. I like it. This is giving me the ability to run as many Linux. I don't know how. What's the plural of Linuxes? Linuxes? Yeah, we'll go with Linuxes. So now if I say WSL-list-V, you can see that I have my default Linux, and I have Kali and Debian also running as well. And I've got Alpine currently stopped. Are we running it in a virtual machine? If I were to go and run something like Hyper-V, I would get this square, which then is like a computer within a computer. And then we have to figure out, well, how do we get our files in there? Do we drag it on top of the thing and let the client figure it out? Also, those tend to be weighty. By weighty, I'm saying it with a hua. It's like 30 or 40 gigs. Like, let me start this virtual machine, and let's go to lunch, right? Let me give you this virtual machine. It's a 30 gig file on a virtual hard drive I'm going to put on a USB key. There's a physical weight and a psychic weight to a virtual machine. This is using hypervisor technology, but it is a lightweight utility virtual machine that is actually expanding and contracting when necessary. And as I shut these down, they will release the memory, and as they need memory, they'll come and go. But when I close that, boop, 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 run HTOP, boop, look at that. I've got 8 processors and the full memory. This is just a Surface laptop. This is not like a fancy computer. I'm not terminaled into anything. I am running full speed on a laptop, and hopefully you can see that I'm having no issue with whipping around, right? Now, is it just a VM? Yes, there is virtual machine technology involved, but you notice that it starts up within a second. So this is actually using a custom Linux kernel that, again, open source, GPL, you can go and look at it. It's all on GitHub. That has some extra little spice in it. It makes it possible to do stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. So let's talk about that. First, we look at the file system. We can note here that we've got WSL file system, and we see a couple of mount points. Let's look at mount points. Here we go. Look at that. What's that? Mount C. Okay, so I'm here in home Scott. Okay, and I've got some code in there. If I go over to mount, hard to type when people are looking. Everyone just look away just a second. I'm going to go users, Scott, OneDrive, desktop. There we go. I'm going to go push D. Okay. All right. So there is my Windows desktop, and it is presented to my Linux as a mount point. Now, if I were to do my work on the Windows file system, there's going to be overhead there. Because it's a mount point, there's a driver, it's expecting one file system, it's going to get NTFS. So there's a lot of overhead. So if I were to just get WSL, and some of you may have used WSL before, and then you may have declared it wanting. Oh, the perf sucks. There's this kind of myth, oh, the perf sucks. almost universally what's happening is you decided to go and do something with Node modules and make 58,000 files because you did a hello world in Node. And then that involved writing to the mount point 58,000 times, and it became a thing. That is a problem. So what you want to do is you want to do your work on the Linux file system. So I'm going to hit popd and wonder why it didn't work. Does popd not work in Linux? That's a scandal. Let's try that again. Push D. Popd and push D are one of my most favorite things. Go over here. Go on back here. Popd. Darn it. Pushing and popping directories. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I wonder why it doesn't work in Ubuntu. Anyone know? No? All right. Not helpful, people. Do better. Just kidding. All right. So if I stay on this file system, though, if I stay on the Linux file system, it's going to be super fast. But then it's like, well, hang on, though. That's just still a virtual machine. Like, if you're going to make me constrain, man, if you're going to make me stick around in the Linux world, what's the point of running it on Windows? Right? That's the accent of a Linux user. Hey, man, what's the deal, dude? Well, wouldn't it be weird? Like here's a shell file. I can go and do VI, right? And then at this point, I don't know how to exit, so I just shut the computer down, right? No other way out. Oh my God, what's happening? But if you really want to bother a Linux user, go like this. What if I could run Windows Notepad? I know. Presenting. Watch. I appreciate your help, though. I appreciate the love. So this is great. I'm going to actually use that. So the gentleman whispers out. By whispers, I mean he shouted into the he says, .exe. Okay. There's no .exes on Linux, right? They have to be schmodded, as the kids say. You got to schmod plus X and make something executable. So I type Notepad. It doesn't know what Notepad is, because that's not a thing. But what if I said notepad.exe? Well, that would be even weirder. Exes don't exist. But what if the path was available from Windows projected into the Linux world, and I could actually type notepad.exe and run Windows apps from Linux? Why would you want to do that, Hanselman? Because it's awesome. What if I wanted to open that shell file there? Where did it go there? That script. Check this out. We updated Notepad to support Linux line feeds, rather. So that's shiny. So now I can edit my Linux stuff in any editor that makes me happy, which is kind of crazy and borderline offensive. Like I'm a little offended, and I work for the company, right? I mean, maybe I could go winword.exe. I don't know if that's in the path or not, but that would be really awful. Imagine opening shell scripts. Imagine supporting people who work at your company who are opening the shell scripts in Word. That would be bad. All right. Can I do calc? Oh my God. What are you doing? This is abomination. Okay, but it's the Linux file system. So what other offensive things could we do? What will happen? Probably nothing good. What? Ubuntu. What is happening? Cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. There's a Linux Tux person in the Windows Explorer. Oh, embrace and extend and extinguish Microsoft with a $sign. Ooh, you suck. No, it's actually awesome because it's free, an update to Windows. It just works, and it makes my workflow and my life a lot easier. In fact, I can click on the little Linux Tux dude or dudette, and I've got Ubuntu and Debian and all of the running Linuxes appearing as file shares. We're actually running a Plan 9 server on the Linux side, and it shows up as a local host. So if I go and say explorer.exe, I'm hitting WSL.localhost. Local network, works on an airplane, not a real network thing. That's what the .localhost is for. And I can file share. So on the Linux side, I have Mount C. And on the Windows side, I have a Plan 9 server. Isn't that cool? That means that I can safely open and edit those files in both places. So what would be some even more offensive things that we could potentially possibly do now that we can run Linux on Windows, right? What if we could run like an X server? That'd be cool. What if we could get audio working? What if anyone on Linux could get audio working, right? Think of the possibilities. What if we could run like a Wayland server? What if we could actually do like machine learning? What if we could expose the NVIDIA card to Linux in Windows and like run, you know, actual machine learning TensorFlow like stuff? Because people are always doing that on laptops, right? Okay, let's see if that would be actually a thing. So that's GIMP running on Windows. Did you notice how fast it started? You notice I didn't have to configure anything? That's called WSL-G. It is built in. So when you go and apt install or snap something on Windows, it shows up in the start menu with a little Linux dude on it, which means I can go and install Firefox or Chrome or whatever, and I can install it with apt-get install, or apt-install rather, and it shows up there immediately, and I can run it, and it works just fine. So then it starts blurring the lines. What happens if I say file open? What am I opening? Right? A portal to hell? We don't know. I can go in here. I'm opening, because it's a Linux app, I'm opening the Linux file system. But then if I wanted to, I could go to my mount point. And my mount point would then be C. Right? And then we could go off into the beast, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And then, you know, look for my JPEGs or whatever that apparently I don't have any installed. And you notice my mouse looks right and my borders look right, but they're actually correct. I can resize it. I can do all the different things you would expect. Scaling, moving between windows, and all that stuff works. And you don't have to install any X server. It's actually using Wayland, and there's a whole blog post about how they went and did this. Now that's cool, but that doesn't tell you how to develop stuff. And this is where things get even more just insane. And this is where I think it's just the cat's pajamas. I'm trying to bring that back, by the way. Because, you know, everything on TikTok is like a meme, and the kids are saying all kinds of new stuff. So I'm trying to bring back phrases from the 1920s. The bee's knees, cat's pajamas. So if you could just casually work that into your conversations at work, I would appreciate that. That would be nice. All right. So I'm here in /home/Scott Hanselman. It's core. And I could go and run Notepad or VI or Emacs or whatever. But what if I could run code, Visual Studio code? But I'm not going to say .exe. I'm just going to say code. I'm going to say code dot. I want you to watch carefully. This code just launched. I didn't say .exe. Something's happening. In the lower left-hand corner here, it says WSL Ubuntu, which is interesting. That's not what it usually says. And now, down here, I've got a terminal inside of Visual Studio Code proper with Ubuntu, and I could type htop, prove that it's real. So then, who is your daddy? What process is this? What is going on here? Whose Visual Studio Code is that? That is Visual Studio Code for Windows, but that code without the exe, code dot, launched something else, something unholy. Find it. I don't remember the keyboard thing for searching for crap. There it is. What? What is it? F3? F3. Kids say F3. Ooh, scrumptious. Thank you. VS Code server. So VS Code split in twain. Is that the word? Close enough. Okay. Split in half, and we've got VS Code server and VS Code client. So it's actually a client-server application right now talking over a named pipe. The Visual Studio Code, the actual work of it, the meat of it, all of the compilers, all of the extensions are running within the context of Linux. The app is running headless, or kind of like, no, bodiless. The head of it is running on Windows, and it's talking back to the Visual Studio Code server. Here's a more visceral way to understand that. I'm actually running a .NET application here. And if I go and say something like var I equals 0, and then I say I dot, and I get this IntelliSense. Who produced that? When I hit dot, it had to talk to a language server. And the language server was on the server side. So we remoted all of that understanding. Even more visceral way to look at that is to look at extensions. We've all got extensions that are local and installed to our Visual Studio codes. Here's my installed. I have 22 extensions installed in VS Code. But what's this? I have 7 extensions with location transparency installed within the context of WSL. So I've got Jupyter Notebooks installed, and I can do Jupyter Notebooks work and Python work, but I don't have Python installed on my Windows machine. Is that interesting? So what else could we do? Control-Z my way back to glory. Come back out here. Get out of here. Oh. I always go back and forth. Because I've spent so much time going Windows and Linux, I end up, like I type CLS on Windows and I type clear on Linux, and then you type Control-L on both. So then I end up just making batch files for stuff. So like I always type .NET, and then I type Docker, and then I started typing Docket. I typed Docket so many times that I just made a batch file called docket.bat that would just do the right thing. So it's time for me to write a shell script or an alias for CLS to be clear, because I always do that. Okay, Docker images. Here are my Docker images. Okay, so I can now run Docker on Windows powered by WSL. So when I install the Docker desktop, it's actually doing the work within WSL. I can go back over into Windows on the PowerShell side, and I can say Docker images. It's the exact same one. I can say WSL-list-v, and you'll note that Docker desktop is its own private WSL instance. It's its own instance of Linux. Now, what are these instances of Linux? They're just user mode files. They're just tar files. So what's cool about that is that you have total control over this. I want to remind you that you have total control over all of this stuff. So if you want to use your own Linux kernel, that's cool. If you want to, pause for effect, export the distribution as a tar file and give it to your coworker, put it in the Windows Store, set it up at work for everyone to do IoT work, get everything perfect for whatever board that you're working on, and say, okay, here's the perfect distribution, and then we go and say WSL import tar file with everything preset up. Makes it really, really easy to get folks set up with exactly what you want. And you could hand them either the tar or an actual VHD and say, here's the virtual hard drive that's already been set up, or put it in the store or whatever. Now, these Docker ones are done by the Docker folks and are created automatically. You'll notice that they separate Docker data from the actual desktop, so you can't really mess it up. One's read-only and one's not, which is very nice and clean. That means that from Windows here, I can then go over to like my podcast website, and then this is PowerShell. Okay. And then I can go and say Docker build, and then I can go and build my .NET website from Docker here, and I can run it. I can do the exact same thing over in Linux, but there are situations where setting your machine up can be really, really complicated, and to get up to speed on like a new project can be really problematic. So what could you do with Docker that would make it easier to dev if you don't know what your target's going to be? Well, take a look at this. So you notice my prompt right here? It's kind of sassy. It's kind of cool because I've got like the current directory. I've got the current Git prompt. I've got the current version of .NET because that's what I work on, but you know, it could be Python or Node or whatever. What do you think that is? Any guess as to what that is? My blood sugar. my blood sugar in real time, because that's more important to me than my get prompt. That's why it's before it. I actually am a cyborg, and I've got an insulin pump, and I've got an implanted sensor that goes from here to my phone, from my phone to the cloud, into Mongo, and then back down and into my prompt. I'm cloud-powered. It's an open-source artificial pancreas. So I'm actually watching that while I'm giving this talk to make sure I don't die. Okay, so this prompt here is not PowerShell. It's just a prompt. This is why I made that whole comment at the beginning about prompts and shells and terminals and consoles. You got to know your terms. The prompt is just the thing that printed that out. And I also have some other cool stuff. You can see I've blinged out things quite nicely. I could go over to here, and I could change this prompt as well to use one of my favorite prompt engines, Oh My Posh. Oh My Posh was a prompt theming engine for PowerShell that is now non-denominational and can work for anything. So you can go and install it on Mac or Linux or whatever. Got Homebrew, got WinGet, which is apt-get for Windows. Got Linux, super awesome. But Oh My Posh uses Go, and I don't have Go installed. And when you test it, I need to test it on Bash and ZSH and Fish and PowerShell, and it's like a whole thing. So getting up to speed on the Oh My Posh development lifecycle would be challenging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out here and I'm going to clone this repository for Oh My Posh. Okay. Cloning into Oh My Posh. Thank you, Internet. And then I'm going to abandon this because it's slow. And I'm going to go to the one that I cloned earlier because I suspected that the Internet was going to fail me on stage, and you can't catch me slipping. This is Oh My Posh right here. I'm going to go ahead and hit code dot. I'm going to open that up in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is going to pop something up and say, what? This folder contains a development container. Do you want to open this as a container? And I will say yes. And then in the lower left-hand corner here, it says opening remote. We've just split in half. We're opening in remote. We're starting up that dev container. Got a terminal that's popping up. I'm going to go over to my extensions. I'm going to note that I have the 22 that I had before locally and 15 recommended extensions by the people who manage Oh My Posh. Those are the extensions that you need to be an effective Oh My Posh developer. Okay? And pre-configured, what? Bash, Tmux, ZSH, Fish, whoosh, whatever you say there, already set up for me. How did we do that? Well, we did have a development container.json with a Docker file within it and a bunch of arguments, including extensions that it recommends. Hello? Notice on line 69 it says Golang, so it's installing Go and the extension that I need for it. I go over to Windows and I type Go. I don't have Go. Go over to Linux and I type Go. I don't have Go. I go over to Visual Studio Code. I type Go. I have Go. Why? Because I am doing all of the development in the container. I cloned a repository, and I'm developing. Immediate. Wasn't that like the promise of the future that we were supposed to have, right? Like you can go and say clone and then configure and make, but that always includes apt-get everything and apt-get upgrade, and you go to lunch. It's a whole thing. With container development like this, not only did everything get installed, all the development tools got installed, it actually mapped a mount point back. So if we look at our current directory, this folder workspaces is in fact paparazzi. Action shot. That workspaces maps back over to my C drive. So then when that container goes away, the results of that build still go there. So it feels very natural. Okay? And I can prove that by looking at the file systems and seeing the mappings and looking at junction points and seeing how that stuff works. all set up automatically. It gives me just the extensions that I want, and then these terminals here that have been pre-configured mean that I can go and say, what would my configured prompt look like in Bash using the build of the Oh My Posh theming engine? You ever get a job and they say, hey, here's your laptop. We don't expect you to be productive for 6 months. Here's a Word document on how to set up the enlistment or whatever, right? With this, you just run it. The container carries everything. We go back out over to here and we say Docker images, or actually let's go Docker ps-a. Pedantic Lamar. I love the little funny names that they give with like famous scientist and then some word. So then here is that particular back-end development container that's running within the context of Docker. And that dev container right here can now be remoted anywhere. You've heard of things like code spaces. You all heard of code spaces? I go over into GitHub. If the internet works today, we go to repositories, and I go to like my blog, and I go code, and I click code spaces. Do I have any code spaces up here? Probably do. Try another one. I want to see if I can make one because I only have 3 minutes left. Now the real question is the gentleman who said he was only going to give me 10 minutes still awake? You there? You up? Are you on the phone or are you still good? Call's over. You're here? Excellent. So now, I can go in here and I can say, I want to have a 4-core, 8 gig of RAM machine spinning up in the cloud for me, and I want to open that code space. Now it's going to fire that up in the cloud at this .github.dev at a particular location. Now this is going to show up inside of my browser. This Visual Studio Code is an Electron app which can then just run in the browser, and that's why you can run Visual Studio Code on an iPad. But I could just as easily take Visual Studio Code and connect it remotely to a development container that happens to be elsewhere. Because code spaces are development containers. Which means if I'm connected, I could talk to my development container, but if I wanted to, I could download that container, run it on an airplane, make my changes, and then push them when I get off the plane. Is that cool? So this is going to go and spin that up. It'll take a while because it's been a couple of weeks since I've been up here. But you get the idea. So I think that this style of development is going to be really, really powerful for the future. And then if you're not a Visual Studio Code person, if you prefer Visual Studio Senior or Visual Studio for Windows, you can still do WSL development. In fact, it'll detect that you have it, and it'll install that support right there. So from Visual Studio proper, I can click WSL, hit F5, and I can do interactive debugging because it will install the Visual Studio Linux debugger and connect to it over named pipes. I can step through my code on Linux. So if I go like this, hit F5, start building, see if we can break this machine. I just realized I'm doing a lot all at the same time. I want to point out, come on, computer. Here's localhost. Actually launch the actual application. Here's the podcasting app running on localhost. And then we end up getting this load over here. Pause for effect. I'm running out of time. What's happening? I don't know if something's not loading here in the browser. But I will hit F12 and do my favorite F12 hack. You know that if you press F12 tools and then you right-click on this thing, you get a special menu that only appears if you, in fact, press F12 tools, which is the refresh but mean it button. So I'm going to hit empty cache and hard refresh. I think there we go. Now it's mad at me. Come on, people are watching. What are you doing? Oh, God, the finale. There we go. Yep, so there's Visual Studio Code connected to a code space. And now I can go and open up my C#, do whatever. There you go. So you have choices. In conclusion, WSL -- install, it will set up Linux for you. You can run any Linux you want. You can run any kernel you want. You can run any distro you want. It's free. It works on Windows Home. Great for students. Windows Terminal is free. Set it as the default. And this combination of development is far superior to Cygwin. And I hope I surprised you. Thank you very much. All right, I thought that went pretty good. Yeah, I felt good about that. All right. I would also encourage you to go out there and check out my podcasts. I've got 864 episodes going back almost 17 years, talking to all kind of cool people. I would encourage you to check it out. I'm actually pretty proud of it. It's kind of like NPR, but for nerds. And you only have 864 episodes to catch up on. So get on that. Thank you.